It's indeed a signal honor to introduce our speaker tonight, who is one of the most distinguished American diplomats of his or any other era. Ambassador Ron Neumann is 3 times U.S. ambassador in some of the most challenging and difficult posts in the world and throughout the greater Middle East region, including Algeria, which is, of course, in North Africa, Bahrain, which is in the Persian Gulf, and then Afghanistan. So across the whole of the what is now known as the greater Middle East region. He has served in the administrations of both Republican and Democratic presidents across a distinguished career, the 3 ambassadorships. By the way, he said, just to keep it short, all you have to do is say 3 ambassadorships, 4 wars, which is also but I'm not quite going to do that. I'm going to say a little more. But which is also the title of one of his books. So he's also a distinguished author. 3 embassies, 4 wars, if you want to jot it down. It's his memoir. But also, he's written widely on the question of Afghanistan, what to do about it, and the question, a number of other questions related to American foreign policy, and especially its foreign policy in the Middle East. Before those ambassadorships, he served with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq after the invasion of that country in 2003. He served in a number of other diplomatic assignments, including as the Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Dubai. A couple of our students were interns there last summer at that embassy. And in Sana'a, Yemen. So just about every trouble spot that you can imagine, he has served in, and served with tremendous distinction. What he's doing now is, if anything, just as interesting and important, because he is the president of the American Diplomatic Academy, which is, I hope he'll say a little bit about that, if not in his remarks, then in Q&A perhaps, because the Academy serves a vital purpose right now, which is to keep in front of the Washington community and the American people the vital importance and necessity of having a vigorous and well-funded, well-resourced, and thoroughly professional diplomacy and diplomatic corps. So he works very hard, along with his associates in the Academy, to promote that objective, both by advocacy and also by events like tonight, which is to talk to the American people around the country about the importance of diplomacy in our statecraft and in American national security. Ambassador Newman is also a decorated combat veteran of the Vietnam War, the United States Army. He's the holder of the Bronze Star, the Army Commendation Medal, a Combat Infantry Badge. He has a long list of State Department and U.S. government commendations and awards, which I can go into in greater detail, but since he wouldn't like me to do that, I'll not do so. He is accompanied tonight by his lovely wife, Elaine. We're so glad to have you here, and who's been with him along this road that I've been talking to you about, and that's a tough road to hoe too, being the spouse of a Foreign Service officer like Ron Neumann. So Ron, he and I have been friends for a long time. Ron, it's a great and distinguished pleasure to welcome you to our podium tonight. Let's give a great Fightin' Texas Aggie welcome to Ambassador Ron Neumann.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's our first time in College Station and Texas A&M, and we actually enjoyed a good piece of today walking around the museum. Learned a lot and realized we could have spent even more time, but our legs gave out. I'm going to take. By the way, that was a very nice introduction, and I thank you. I thank you for keeping it reasonably short. I will take advantage of your invitation for a brief commercial announcement about my day job at the American Academy. The Academy is an organization now 34 years old. It's always been small. It was founded by people like Henry Kissinger and Dean Rusk, and George Kennan was a founding member of the Academy. It's still very small. We only take in about 20 members a year. It's all people with senior backgrounds, all out of government, except when they go back in government, then I can't get their dues. But we've got a couple back right now, like Jim Jeffrey. But it's an organization which is completely private, nonpartisan, non-governmental, and its purpose is really twofold. One is talking to Americans about what diplomacy is and trying to reach out to more people, recognizing that the younger generation, and there's a lot of people now that are younger, so we're trying to reach out to them. We started 2 new podcasts, as a matter of fact, that some of you might find interesting. One called The General and the Ambassador. We figured more Americans understand generals than understand ambassadors, so we'd put them together. So we've got a number of those former commanding generals talking with the ambassadors they worked with. Started off with Dave Petraeus and Ryan Crocker, and have gone on to a whole lot of others. There's one I particularly like with Jim Jeffrey when he was ambassador in Iraq, and Lloyd Austin was the CENTCOM commander, which I think really should be retitled, How We Fought Washington and the Islamic State Together. But anyway, they're a lot of fun. There's another series called American Diplomat that is a series of little vignettes out of people's lives, but in the process tells you a lot about diplomacy. And we're hoping some people will begin to pick them up. So that's one line of effort. The other is telling the State Department what it could do better, and I'm sure they always appreciate our advice. But we've got a new study that will be coming out. We've hammered at them a number of issues. I think we can say in our own defense that we have been equally critical in multiple administrations. So with that commercial announcement, let me go on to the subject tonight. Diplomacy has received a great deal of discussion, but I think a lot of that discussion, it mixes up the issues of policy and diplomacy. And tonight I'd like to try to separate those. What I want to talk about are 3 issues. One is what is the difference between policy and diplomacy, very briefly. Second is what is diplomacy's role? And the third is why a professional diplomacy is needed, and how does America's current posture measure up to the need? On the question about diplomacy and policy, I think it's worth remembering policy is ultimately the domain of our elected leaders. At the highest level, it is what decisions that are made, policy goals selected by the president and his national security team. There's a great deal one can say about this, and there's also a lot of policy that gets made at lower levels in the process of active diplomacy. But effectively, my main point is that diplomacy is essentially about how we get others to do what we want them to do. It's not just about making nice. But neither is it strong-arming others. My favorite short definition of diplomacy is telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. Why this is important says a good deal about the nature of diplomacy. It's ongoing. It doesn't end with the accomplishment of any particular goal. Those that one works against today may be the people that you will have to work with, the countries that you will have to work with tomorrow in order to accomplish some other goal. So a certain degree of politeness and courtesy are not about being politically correct, but rather it's about being effective. And this basic realization is the reason that diplomats try not to break crockery unnecessarily. Because if you alienate individuals or countries, it'll be that much harder to work with them on tomorrow's issues. Shouting at somebody make you feel good, but it's really an obstacle to reaching agreement. And that's as true of diplomacy as it is of personal relations. And this is also why diplomats look for ways of reaching our goals in ways that allow others to reach some of theirs. Now, that isn't always possible, but the agreement most likely to be respected are those in which each side achieves some of its aims. That is, looking forward to the trip. An agreement that's seen by one party as having been forced is likely only to last as long as you can hold that position. The result of weakness and pressure creates the conditions for the other side to break the agreement. And perhaps the most famous example of that, of peace treaties, of that phenomenon of what happens when you force others, are the treaties that ended World War I, treaties of Versailles. Those agreements were certainly not the only reason for the rise of Hitler, but they created a narrative on which he could build in coming to power. The peace treaty with Turkey at the same time was so disadvantageous to the Turks that it led to the overthrow of the government, a war, the expulsion of the Greek population who'd been living in Turkey for going on 1,000 years, and created a situation which we still live with. So that's not to say that all agreements are like that. Many bad agreements are not quite that catastrophic, but you get the point. Agreements that give something to both sides are far more likely to advantage us over the long term than one-sided victories that carry the seeds of new problems. So practicing diplomacy also requires certain skills. One is listening. Understanding the limits of the possible in any situation requires understanding what's important to the other side. It's about distinguishing between preferences, which you may be able to push or seek to alter, and deeply held beliefs or perceptions of interest that are not going to change. Understanding the difference is critical to forming policies that can work and recognizing those which are doomed from the start. And I was interested today when my wife and I were strolling around the Bush Museum to see a little, one of many, many little signs where he talked about his 4 rules for working in Congress, and they included listening and always being polite. So I thought, there is a bygone day in which people thought you could even do this in politics. But clearly he recognized the essentiality of what I'm talking about. Now, it's often said, usually disparagingly, that the diplomat's main role is to observe and report. What this usually disparaging comment fails to understand is that this is not a passive occupation, but it's a vital part of the policy process. It's how one shapes the advice to Washington about policies that are most likely to be effective, how policy is working, and how it might be adjusted for success. When I negotiated the extension of a base agreement in Oman, I had to work between the desires of the U.S. Defense Department to give absolutely nothing away that might become a precedent for the other 100-plus countries that have similar agreements, and the desires of Oman to protect their sovereignty in various ways. So understanding the limits of the possible was a part of, a critical part of success. A different example, but a bad example, that is an example of failure, not a bad example, I think it's a good example, but an example of not paying attention to these differences came in 2011 in the negotiations in Iraq to keep our forces in country. President Obama's administration decided that it had to have the agreement ratified by the Iraqi parliament. Now, this was after I'd left Iraq, but I was still following issues fairly closely. That pressure to have a parliamentary agreement was driven by a view of U.S. lawyers. But those working on the ground knew from the beginning that this was totally impossible. In the context of Iraqi politics, there was no way the parliament was going to vote for that agreement, even though many understood that they wanted the forces there. And so as a result of that position of ignoring the realities on the ground, the negotiations failed. When the Islamic State suddenly burst on the scene 3 years later, we were much worse positioned than we would have been had we had forces in the country. And we reintroduced forces without such a parliamentary vote and with the kind of diplomatic agreement we could have had before. This is what observing and reporting are all about. Another characteristic of good diplomacy is understanding the cultural sensitivities of the host government. When then-Senator Biden criticized Afghan then-President Karzai for corruption, Biden did it in front of much of the Afghan cabinet. In Afghan culture, however, no friend would attack another friend in public in this way unless you were signaling that you were no longer friends and probably that you were switching sides. So the result of this was that Biden came out feeling that, by God, he'd told him about corruption, and Karzai came out thinking it can't be about corruption, so what is it they're really doing? This laid the seeds for a long period of deterioration in our relations, much of which were informed by similarly uninformed, that's a polite word, actions. I could probably tell stories about such misunderstandings and their consequences all night. But the point is that a great deal of effective diplomacy comes from understanding these kind of issues. Again, it's not about being nice. It's not about hiding the truth, as I told you with my little joke about going to hell. It's actually about delivering the message, but it's about how you deliver the message. And that's not always easy. But it leads to my other point, which is why diplomacy is needed and how does America's current posture measure up to that need. Now, the U.S. has had a professional diplomatic corps for about 100 years. It took us the first 100 years to decide we needed to be professional. All our initial diplomats were what we would now call political appointees, some very good, many a result of who lost an election. But we finally got a professional diplomacy. And like the military, Foreign Service officers take an oath to the Constitution. They are have rank in person the way the military does, not rank in civil service has rank in jobs. If you need a higher promotion, you've got to find a job with a higher rank. Civil service, like the military, officers carry their rank with them. They're subject to selection out for low ranking or time and grade, and they're subject to worldwide posting. Now, they're augmented not only by specialists and various types of support, but by civil service personnel, mostly serving domestically, who have become many of our most important experts in issues from arms control to trade negotiations. So the needs of diplomacy, the need for diplomacy and for a profession requires study and application as in any other professional field. This is not to say that the gifted amateurs can't be diplomats. Our first great diplomat, Benjamin Franklin, would be considered now a political appointee. And in fact, my father was a non-career political appointee. He was a little bit odd because he served 4 presidents, 3 posts, and 2 parties, but came from outside the career service. But I think it's important to say that while all the traditional responsibilities of diplomacy remain present, the modern world has added a enormous number of new factors. I think that's important because people will often say, okay, well, what do we need for the 21st century? And there's a lot of stuff that goes in that. But it's important to remember that there are virtually no major responsibilities of a 19th century diplomat for which we are not still responsible. So all the new stuff is an add-on top of the old stuff. Now, we have recently turned in our electric quill sharpeners, and we're a little more modern, but we've still got a lot of the same responsibilities. Among these new aspects, you have the fact that American interests that are domestic and foreign have merged, so that you now have over 20, I think it's now 26 cabinet departments and agencies overseas at our embassies. Our diplomats are often a minority in our embassies because of the posting of all the other people. The ambassador has the broadest grant of authority in the federal government because he or she is in charge of everyone from the executive branch in the country, no matter what agency they come from, except those in the military who are under a combined forces commander. Any other military are still under the ambassador's authority. And, you know, one of the big jobs of the ambassador is to keep all these folk coordinated, or at least keep them from bumping into each other, not letting them be at cross purposes. Language is particularly important to understanding culture and to communicating. You really don't understand people the same way if you don't speak their language. And interpreters, by the way, are not necessarily, use interpreters if you have to. They're not a sole answer. I did the last negotiation, I think, with the sheikhs in the Iraqi town of Fallujah before we fought the Second Battle of Fallujah. And negotiations didn't work. We ended up leveling the town and killing a lot of people and losing a lot of people. But in the course of these negotiations, I had the Marine Division Commander's interpreter, best we had in the area, and I had to stop him 3 times because he was leaving out a critical element that I was trying to get across to these folks. I didn't think my Arabic was quite good enough to do the negotiation, but it was good enough to know that I was losing a big piece here. And I don't think he was trying to sabotage me. I think he just didn't understand the issue. One of the things you find with interpreters is that if they, except for the very, very most skilled, those essentially working for presidents and chiefs of state, they don't stop to ask you if they don't understand something. They either guess or they leave it out. So there's no substitute for having the language if you're going to deal with other folk. Diplomacy is a sometimes dangerous profession. Diplomats are neither soldiers nor spies, but their job often requires taking risks. There are 250 names on the plaque in the State Department of those who have died in the line of duty. And some, like the first name of William Palfrey in 1780, were lost at sea or died of yellow fever. But as one gets into the 20th century, they were killed in ambushes in Vietnam, murdered in Beirut, died, as you all know, in Benghazi, or murdered by suicide bombers in Afghanistan. That political appointees practically never go to the places where these risks arise says something about the need for a professional diplomacy. So, since this is a speech and not a seminar class, let me just make one more point about the needs for a professional diplomacy, and that is that the U.S. military has become the foremost proponent of a properly funded and staffed diplomatic service. Every year, literally hundreds of generals and former generals and admirals, flag star officers spend time in Congress talking about the need for proper funding. They endlessly quote General, later Secretary of Defense Mattis, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." It's such a pithy quote that it gets a little overused, but it does get at the heart of the matter. So, what is the state of the diplomatic profession for the United States? In a word, poor. Not nearly as bad as it was in the first year of this administration, which was a disaster. The cuts inflicted by then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson did more harm to our diplomacy in a year than I would have thought possible. We lost about 25% of our most senior diplomats, the equivalent of 3- and 4-star generals. Intake was cut. Like the military, the Foreign Service recruits only at the bottom. If you don't bring in enough lieutenants this year, you don't have enough majors in 10 years, you don't have enough colonels in 20 years. Same is true of the Foreign Service. We cut off intake. A mindless hiring freeze was kept in place for over a year, leading to massive shortages at posts and in Washington. Perhaps worst, obviously my judgment, was that aside from the cuts themselves, there was no plan for what the workforce was supposed to look like with smaller numbers, what tasks would no longer be performed, or what responsibilities given up or shifted to someone else. To his credit, Secretary Pompeo has ended the worst of these practices and lifted the hiring freeze. But there is not yet hiring authority to replace what has been lost, and replacing experience takes years. Some of the damage turns out to be much more difficult to unwind than to cause, all sorts of systemic distortions that I can go into if anybody really wants that level of painful detail. The Foreign Service today is recruiting competitively. Getting past the entrance exam is slightly harder than getting into Harvard. But the Foreign Service does little to train or professionally educate the staff that it has. Currently, too many embassies have no ambassadors, and too many critical senior positions for running the department at home remain empty. In filling particularly the domestic positions, this is the worst performance of any administration that I have seen in almost half a century that I've been engaged in this profession. Now, Secretary Pompeo and his team are trying to rebuild. They are concerned about morale, and they are working to staff senior positions, ambassadorships, and they are doing better, I think, than many give them credit for. But they're working in an administration that radiates contempt for diplomacy, in case you thought I was still a diplomat. in their budgets it sends to Congress, budgets that Congress regularly rejects on a strong bipartisan basis. Maybe I should be glad that funding diplomacy is one of the very few areas that has not been subject to the bitter partisan wrangling that marks so many other subjects in Congress. Still, I wish they didn't have that starting point. So, where does this leave us? There is a need for a professional diplomatic corps to achieve the nation's foreign policy goals. The habits, knowledge, and skills required merit a professional corps loyal to the Constitution and dedicated to carrying out the policies of whatever administration is elected by the American people. We have such a group. It has taken some hits, and it is bruised, but it is very much there and still capable of rebuilding. But it needs to be supported, trained, and funded just as any other professional corps does. And I submit that America's professional diplomats are such a corps. They are in some 270 posts around the world. They are looking after Americans in trouble, fighting drugs and terrorists, implementing policy, and taking risks to make sure Washington has the best possible judgment of realities as it compiles our policies. The best judgments, that is, that our men and our women can give them. And they're worth the support of the American people. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions. And let me say that if I have touched any sensitive nerves in any of this, I encourage you to push back, because I would like the debate. Do you want to moderate this? Did you? I see we got chairs, so.
Okay, and he's already said, right? Okay.
Sounds like I'm on.
Are we coming across? Right. Good. Well, Ron, I think what we'll do is, if you don't mind, we'll just open the floor for questions. But if you don't mind, I'll
You got the moderator's privilege.
You're, of course, an expert on Afghanistan. You follow matters there closely, and you've written widely on the subject. I wonder what you think of the current negotiations that are underway between the United States and the Taliban, and whether you think there's a prospect for those to be successful.
There is a prospect of their being successful. There is a prospect of their being successful at the price of our essentially deserting Afghanistan and having a decent interval before disaster. It is too early to tell which. I do follow the subject, and I try to go back every year because since I insist on talking about it, I feel a certain requirement to try to update my knowledge. I was back last in November. I think there's a limit to how much you can know in one trip, but I think I packed in about 40 appointments in 5.5 days with civilians, military, government, opposition, whatever. The recognition that we need a peaceful solution is absolutely correct. And I think Ambassador Khalilzad is working very hard at that. I don't think the president helped him by tweeting that we wanted to pull out half the force before the negotiations start. It's sort of like, here's half my chips, now let's gamble about the rest. Doesn't help you, raise stakes in the game. It's a very tense period. The Taliban is making progress on the ground. They cannot win as long as we're there. So I think when people talk about this, we often jump into, we've been at it 20 years, time to leave. Negotiations are the only way. And those things have a certain truth to them, but I think the starting point has got to be, how do you consider, what is it you want to get out of this? Now, I have skin in the game. There's no point in my trying to pose as a completely disinterested observer. But I would submit that having lost 3,000 Americans in New York from an al-Qaeda attack, that we have a minimum conditions that we do not wish to leave al-Qaeda a free hand in Afghanistan, And now that you have the Islamic State established in Afghanistan, and they're not big, but they're pretty tough, we don't really want to leave them a place where they can say, now we've won against the second superpower and we're regrouping. If you can get those kind of conditions in a peace negotiation, you should. It's not yet clear that you can. It's not yet clear that the Taliban will agree to those, other than to give you paper promises, which I hope nobody necessarily believes, since no Afghan government, no Afghan promises of the last 40 years on any side have necessarily been kept once they were strong enough to break them. So verification and enforcement of an agreement will be important. So if you can get an agreement that meets minimum strategic goals, we should definitely be wanting to take it. We will still have to deal with questions like, we've accomplished a great deal in terms of women's rights in Afghanistan, and social betterment, and education. There's a whole young, educated population that didn't exist 20 years ago. How much do we feel that we have to give them a chance of maintaining those goals or not? Those are serious questions, probably don't quite rise to the level of the national security ones of terrorism, but they're important. So one question is, can you get the negotiation? Maybe. But the second order is, if you can't get the negotiation, what are you doing? Are you just running? Do you want any cover you can get and bolt? Or are you going to sustain the minimum of what you've got? And I'll just close so I don't do a whole Afghan lecture here, but I think too often the discussion of Afghanistan looks backwards and says, okay, we've lost, about 2,600 dead, we've had over 20,000 wounded, so it's cost us several trillions of dollars, we can't keep that cost. And that's absolutely true, except that sustainment doesn't require that. Sustainment would require something in the order of a little less than 1% of the defense budget. And right now, a lot of Afghans are getting killed. We're losing fewer people in Afghanistan than we lose in training accidents in the United States. So this is a question of political will, which may evaporate, but it's not a question of some absolute that you can't possibly do that. You could certainly maintain that cost if you want to. And we don't know where the negotiations come out. Right now, I think what the Taliban want is they want us to go away for free. And they don't really want to deal with the internal, they have a lot of internal fractures and issues within their own ranks. As long as they are negotiating toward our withdrawal for free, they don't have to deal with the complications in their own ranks. At some point, I think, and maybe not too far from now, I suspect we're going to hit a kind of a fork in the road, where either we're going to say, okay, here's the picture of all the stuff you want, you can have, but you have to negotiate a real peace with the Afghan government. Or we're going to walk past that point on the other fork, and we're going to keep negotiating until we've essentially negotiated our way out with no real peace in Afghanistan. Now, is that all clear?
That's as clear as mud. Yeah. Why don't we open the floor now, and we'll recognize questions. And do we have a microphone so that we can hear? Yes. And we'll get a mic to you so that everybody can hear your question. Sir, on the front row, perhaps. Becca, down here on the front. Oh, Emily's got it. Okay.
Zalmay is clearly an individual who understands the arena in which he's competing, but it's also interesting to see the forum in which he's negotiating and to the degree he's involving the Afghan government. Could you expand a little bit on that, please?
To the extent I know, because this is hugely controversial. The Afghan National Security Advisor, some of you may notice, just showed up in Washington and basically said Khalilzad is effectively running a separate negotiation. He's not telling us anything. We don't know what's happening. We think he's trying to make an Afghan protectorate with him the sort of supreme leader in the future, and that really aggravated the government in Washington, which has said we no longer wish to deal with Mr. Moheb, the Afghan National Security Advisor. Just go home and shut up. I think what is going on, let me try to keep this simple, but Afghanistan is not a simple place. Khalilzad is pushing the Afghan government to form a kind of multi-party negotiating group that would represent a number of political factions. President Ghani is not totally resisting that, but his bottom line is the government of Afghanistan should lead this group, should be the voice of Afghanistan in negotiations. That would be a very correct position if you were not in the midst of a presidential election in Afghanistan. If that were the position a year ago, I think we should be supporting it. And it could be the position a month after an election when you have a government. But right now, the issues of the election and the negotiations are intertwined. And any negotiation is also going to have to be acceptable. If the result of the negotiation becomes a political football, then that would doom the negotiations just as much as anything we might do. So I think what Ghani is trying to do has a theoretical sense, but it defies the electoral compass in which you have to involve these others. Now, exactly how you involve them, how much, it is bitterly disputed, and I think that's the underlying piece, that the government was being cut out, but I think it was being cut out as part of a pressure tactic. Whether that tactic is right or wrong, how it comes out, those are, you'd have to be really in the middle of things, I think, to have a really valid opinion of that, which I don't, and then somebody else would equally in the middle could probably dispute it. But I think that's the big picture of what's going on. I can tell you that these negotiations are scaring the hell out of Afghans because they don't know what's going on. They have a memory of 40 years of war. I mean, it's useful in understanding Afghans, if you don't mind my just taking another minute on this.
Sure, absolutely.
There are very few people in this audience who, if you were an Afghan, would have remembered the days of peace in Afghanistan. You've got to be close to my age or Larry's.
Yeah, our age. Yeah.
And there's some of you I see who would fit that definition. But for any of you younger people, you have to remember this is a place where they have not known peace. We look at peace as normal, and if you have a war, we think, how do you get back to peace? There are a lot of Afghans who've never had that memory. This war is a permanent thing, and we're people of plans, and if our plans are working, we're fairly optimistic they're going to work. Their life experience is disruption. And it's difficult to get across to Americans how that influences people's thinking. There's a young Afghan woman who runs an Afghan girls' school in Kabul. I'm on their board of advisors. I've gone out a few times to see the school. They're very impressive. She's a graduate of Middlebury. She's an excellent administrator. She's a ball of fire. She's raised several $1 million. She's gotten land from President Ghani. They're building a new campus for the girls. She told me when she first came to the United States, she got off the plane, met by her host family, and they said, you've really come at a good time because we've got a 3-day weekend coming up in whatever it was, 2 or 3 months, and we're going to an amusement park. And she said her first thought was, how can they be planning for something 3 months from now? And she said she spent the whole time in between waiting for the plan to collapse. Because that's the level of disruption that she had lived with that was normal. So when you get people used to that much disruption, worried about it, tense about it, and you cut them off from knowledge in the negotiations, and there are an awful lot of people who see their, is this a future I can live with, or is this one I'm going to have to try to run from, or is this going to take me back to the Dark Ages? It gives you some sense of the nervousness. Anyway, sorry, that was a kind of long answer.
Right, and if you add to that for a decade, the United States departed essentially from Afghanistan, and they're also afraid of that you will just...
Totally. That is the long pole in the tent. Yep.
Yep. Sir, on the right there.
Yes, sir. 2 things, if you could speak to them. One is the Iran nuclear deal, and the second one is the Kurds in northern Iraq, southern Turkey. Can you speak to either or both of those, please?
I can. I'm not sure how much time.
You'd need a half hour on each, probably.
Well, let me try to make a few points which will make it too simple and therefore probably aggravate somebody. I personally think there were some problems with the Iran nuclear deal. The biggest problem, there are two issues that people have argued about. One is how much does it prevent Iran from going nuclear? And the other is that it did not include in the agreement any control on their development of ballistic missiles. Maybe it should have. On the nuclear issue, first of all, Iran was running, I don't know what it was, 20, 30,000 centrifuges. Right. They were 2 or 3 months, our intelligence agencies calculated, away from the capacity to begin building a nuclear weapon if they wanted one. All of that has been given up. The inspection regime is working, and the IAEA continues to say that Iran is continuing to actually follow the agreement. Is that permanent? I don't know. Nothing in life is guaranteed to be permanent. It was, in my view, much better than being a few months away from the possibility of breakout. Therefore, I would argue that leaving it was a mistake. But the administration has a different view, which they have certainly articulated. It is difficult to see. One question will be, okay, you broke out. Now is that policy working? So far, the answer is no. Maybe it will in the future. Europeans, Russians, Chinese that are all part of the agreement have not gone with us. They are looking for ways to get around. They don't respect the sanctions. Their companies are afraid of them, so the sanctions are having some effect. But they're not nearly as effective as the sanctions we had before the agreement, which had broad worldwide support. There is a drumfire of effort by the administration to try to line up other countries, to try to get them on board, to try to impose Iran. The underlying issue is actually neither of those two that I mentioned. Is Iran's place in the region, its support for Hezbollah, its presence in Syria, all of which are Yemen, although I think that's overstated. And so this breaking out is supposed to be part of a broader policy to roll back those things. That's a very correct goal, I would submit. I don't think the policy is achieving it, and the disagreement with many of our allies over the nuclear agreement is actually making it harder, I would argue, to build the kind of coalition we want to put pressure on the other actions. But there's lots of room for discussion. Quickly on the Kurds. My God, I've done Kurds for a long time because I was consul in Tabriz in the northwest of Iran with all of the Kurdish areas of the Iran-Iraq border in my consular district during the '74 Iraq Kurdish rebellion in Iraq. And I knew a lot of the leaders when they came into Iran after the collapse of that rebellion. And then I was director of the Iran-Iraq office after the first Gulf War. When I worked with a lot of those guys, we were doing Operation Provide Comfort to protect them in the north. And then when I went to Baghdad, one of the first things Ambassador Bremer wanted me to do was go work with Kurds. And I've been at that issue a spell. There are two separate issues between the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds. The Iraqi Kurds, with a certain amount of reluctance, basically realized that their vulnerability required that they work within Iraqi politics. And they had very tense relations with Turkey, but they rebuilt their relations with Turkey to the point where they had actually fairly friendly relations. And you have an Iraqi Kurd as the president of Iraq as a result of being part of the internal politics. Now, they made a huge mistake in going for a referendum, which was not going to have any particular effect on independence. Everybody told Masoud Barzani, who was pushing this, not to do this. We told him that. Every major European government told him that. The Turks told him that. And some of their fellow Kurds on another part of the Kurdish political spectrum didn't like the idea but went along. They held the referendum anyway. That triggered a fierce revolt from the Iraqi state. One of the prized possessions of the Iraqi Kurds was the oil area in Kirkuk. When the Iraqi forces moved in after some fighting started, the part of the Kurdish coalition that had never supported Barzani's referendum basically took the view, well, I didn't like this in the first place, and damned if I'm going to fight for it. And so they basically pulled out, and so the Kurds lost a lot of ground. They lost a big area of oil resources. They lost a lot of political position, which they're slowly rebuilding. But they have a position within Iraq that they can manipulate to secure a lot of their future, and they still have a lot of support from us. And they have a workable relationship with Turkey. It's one of the things, one of the reasons I personally have never supported a Kurdish state in Iraq is because Kurds are in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. Now, those four states don't agree on many things. But one of the things they agree on is they don't want a Kurdish state. So if you're going to have a Kurdish state, it is going to have foreign protection. Basically, we are going to have to be prepared to fight to preserve a Kurdish state. If we are not prepared to fight for that Kurdish state, it will be destroyed. And I've argued for many years that if we support Kurdish independence and really are not prepared, as I believe we're not, to keep it alive, then we're just setting a lot of people up to get killed. Syrian Kurds have a very different situation. The Syrian Kurdish organization is connected to the PKK in Turkey, which has been in a war with the Turkish government for about 30 years on and off, which is on our list of terrorists. They had a lot of reasons for fighting with us. We had a lot of reasons for helping them. But they also, I think, ignored a lot of political advice to get rid of those ties, to build a separate political entity, to try to work the way the Iraqi Kurds had to build a relationship with Turkey. They've ignored all of that. They've maintained their ties to the Turks. We had a very funny policy. This was convenient for us to have them as allies to beat the Islamic State. And we knew from the get-go that the Turks were vehemently opposed to our arming this group. And our basic view was, well, we'll do that later. Right now, this is convenient. So it was essentially a transactional relationship of convenience. We supported them in order to defeat the Islamic State, and they fought in that war partly because they were hostile to the Islamic State, but largely for their own purposes. Now what you've got is pressure from the Turks. We're trying to get out. We need, I think, if we can, to negotiate something that keeps them alive. I personally think that our responsibility is limited because we did each fight for our own purposes. I don't think they just fought for us. And I think, therefore, a pretty hard-edged view that our moral debt is actually much more limited than many people say. That's a very disputable statement, but I put it out there as clearly as I can so others can argue about it. Frankly, our ability to keep them secure is very limited. We have less than 2,000 troops in Iraq now. In Syria. That is not a totally adequate force to make people do what we want. The withdrawal of the force is the biggest negotiating chip we have in any complex negotiation with the Turks, the Syrians, and others. But again, having pre-announced that we're leaving, we have greatly weakened the potential leverage of that force to be a bargaining chip. So what we did and you're right, this could go on all night, but in Syria, we had a military policy that was not tied to a political policy. We had, from Obama to Trump, and I would say this equally of both administrations, we had absolutely no idea of what we were trying to accomplish politically. We had a limited military goal, but at the end of that military goal, there was obviously a huge panoply of political issues which we simply chose to ignore because they were just too hard to think about. Then we probably had some other better options earlier on in the Obama period, which we managed to blow past without any significant attention. A lot of internal debate, no actions. So now we've got ourselves in a position where we would like to do something, but we're leaving, and we're very limited. And I don't know where this comes out. The chances are that the Syrian Kurds are perfectly capable of working out an arrangement with the Syrian government if they absolutely have to, and the chances are very good that over a few years the Syrian government won't keep that agreement. And in that, now that I've raised your confusion to a higher level of detail, that's about all I can tell you.
All right. How about right here, this young lady in the blue dress?
What advice, sir, that would you give young adults who are interested in pursuing a diplomatic route for their career?
I would advise you to go ahead and take the Foreign Service exam and try to get in. And I would say that in giving you that advice, I think I am echoing the advice of every former senior Foreign Service officer I know, and a number of those who are still in. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One is the nation needs qualified, good people. That's not going to change. Secondly, whatever you think of the current administration, but you know, it may be here for 2 years, it may be here for 6 years. In terms of the process of getting in, the kind of things you're going to do in that early period, you're not going to be seriously affected if you don't much like this bunch. And if you do, you probably won't have a real chance to do a whole lot for them anyway. So I wouldn't get too wrapped around the axle on current situation, either pro or con. I would look at, first of all, it's a gut check. Is this the profession you want? It's a fascinating profession. It has its downsides, moving, wars, but it is utterly fascinating. And the nation needs good people. And so I would encourage you to go in. In fact, tell you a little story. Many of you, I think, have probably seen the movie Argo about the taking of the embassy in Tehran. And the American Foreign Service Association did an interesting thing. They had a special showing of the movie just for Foreign Service officers. They rented the whole movie theater for the night. But what was really interesting was at the end of the movie, they had several of the people who were actually involved in the situation, the real people. The real Tony Mendez, the CIA agent, John Limbert, who was one of the hostages who did not get out with a group in Canada, Hearn, and Kathleen Stafford, the wife of, if you remember the kind of mousy-looking guy with the big glasses in the movie, that was Joe Stafford, her husband, who was later my deputy in Algeria. And at the end of this question and answer, one person said to this particular group, given what you went through in your career, would you recommend this profession to other people? And every single one of them said yes. And to me, it was a powerful moment.
Good. Yes, sir.
If I could use a much-used word and ask you to pivot to two areas of contemporary issue. One, the widespread use of disinformatia, of fake news on a much broader scale, and also current and future relations with China and the Asian world.
I can. None of them are areas on which I have any particular expertise. So I would say, happy as we all are to share opinions, I wouldn't get too carried away with the intrinsic value of them. We have, on the fake news, I think we have a much bigger problem sort of an unintended consequence of the internet, which is that while it gives one access to a great deal more information, it also allows one to essentially curate what you read and stick in your comfort zone. And that's a problem. This is not a new problem. There was a book by Eric Hoffer back in the 50s called The True Believer. And one of the things he pointed out was when you only deal with people who you agree with, you spin yourself up emotionally. And the more you have that discussion in your own group, the more you come to the view that what you have is truth. And obviously, if you have truth, then people who don't agree with you are either liars, hypocrites, or fools, because they must know that this is the truth, but they're not following it. So it cuts you off from intellectual discourse if you don't talk to people who have different views. And, that's always been a problem, but actually our flow of information permits you to have that electronically. So quite apart from what's fake, there's also what do people believe is fake, and how do people go about evaluating news, information, how much do you think as well as react? I don't have an answer except that, the kind of people who are interested in coming to a lecture like this are the kind of people who hopefully will take the initiative to try to think for themselves and to try to understand why people who don't agree with them believe something else, which was also something I noticed walking around today. And one of the things President Bush had, late President Bush had in the museum was this. There was very much this. How do you talk to people with whom you don't agree? Mm-hmm. How do you move forward? I think you've got a great example right here. What was the other part? China?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's really worth my blathering on about something I don't know a lot about. We have a competitor. It's not yet, it's not determined, as far as I tell reading, so please take this for what it's worth, which may be little. It is not an ideological competitor in the sense the Soviet Union was, which is determined to push for conquest. But it is a rising power determined to change the rules of the game. And so one big question, which I don't see people writing about as very much, is are there ways of accommodating some of what China wants in rewriting the rules of the game without simply giving up? And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a question that needs to be discussed. There is a danger that we could get into a war with China, which would be pretty bad. There is a shaping now, certainly in the national security strategy, of reshaping our military strategy to confront China and Russia. And there are reasons for both of that. Whether there is an adequate political strategy, I don't know. It hasn't really been. The question of do you have a choice is not being discussed quite as much as I wish it would be. I don't know that I do not have a worthwhile opinion on whether we have a choice. Our old view, which we followed for many years, many administrations, was a view that what we wanted was to help China rise and to bring them into a sort of international rules of the game. Now, it's clear that China does not completely agree with rules they had no hand in writing. It is not at all clear what they think the rules should be, or whether they have thought that through. And so one piece is probably, yes, you're going to have to push back. The other piece is, do you have room for diplomatic, political compromise at a price that we would find acceptable and sustainable? And I don't see many people writing about that, but maybe they're out there and I'm not reading the right stuff.
Good. We have probably time for another 2 or 3 questions. So
Hopefully ones
Gentlemen.
about which I might actually know something.
You previously mentioned the importance of not alienating other countries, especially with regard to China. How do we do that while addressing human rights violations and corruption at times?
Oh, that's fun. Because I think, first of all, I think what it gets at is one of the most essential issues of diplomacy that I think is badly understood is the fact that we have multiple interests. And we say that, but then how often have you heard people say, well, the problem is you haven't got your priorities right? Well, one of the debilities of a large power with multiple interests is there probably is no absolute stacking order for priorities. Take one example, Egypt. Keeping the Suez Canal open is vital to the economy of the United States. No government of the United States which was not concerned about the economic well-being of the American people would be doing a very good job. Keeping the the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in being has kept us out of a major Middle Eastern war since 1973 with the ceasefire agreements, and
Right.
76
74.
when we negotiated the treaty. And we have an interest in human rights, and Egypt has a miserable record. Now, first question is but this is a little phony in a way because you see the answer, but are you prepared to sacrifice, which two are you prepared to sacrifice for the third? Well, the answer obviously is you're not. So, but that gets to the first point that you've got to be able to walk and chew gum. You've got to be able to do multiple things. So, where are you going? We have a level of criticism of human rights that we should maintain a level of human rights because I think you can't get away, first because of moral responsibility, and secondly because I think it's what a large portion of the American people want. Should you always put that first? Well, I would argue probably not. Obviously, you've got the question of Saudi Arabia now front and center. I suspect that might have been in your mind. Saudi Arabia is an enormously important country for a lot of reasons. There's also the fact that if you ever brought down the government of Saudi Arabia, you have no idea what you would get in its place. And what has happened since the so-called Arab Spring, which looks a hell of a lot more like the Arab Winter, that does not suggest that you want easily to invite chaos. And at the same time, going out and murdering a journalist who works in the United States as a permanent resident in your embassy in another country is pretty intolerable. So what are you going to do about this? Well, Congress is a little help because they're shoving, but Congress has only very blunt tools to work with. They can cut off money, they can cut off arms. But Congress can only do scalpel with a meat cleaver, so they're not going to be able to really do the job for you. So I think what you've got to do in Saudi Arabia is you've got to exact, my view, not necessarily the administration, you have to exact some price. You have to try to exact a price when you have an action this egregious that says you have crossed a line, you can't do that again. And you also probably have to understand that that price is not going to go up as far as removing the virtual head of government. And that might not be morally satisfying to a lot of people. But I think that's the balance. And then you're in a question of what is the tactics, what is the price. But I think that is the reality of how you have to deal with that subject in the real world, where you have no higher judicial authority to which you can appeal, and where you have real interests that you don't want to jeopardize, that you shouldn't jeopardize in the interest of the American people and in the interest of stability in the region, and yet you have to get a message across more than verbally. That's not a wholly satisfying answer, but it I think gives you a sense of the complexity of doing foreign policy.
Yeah, it's a matter of realizing at all times that matters can always get worse.
That is true.
And probably will if allowed to.
Absolutely.
Would you like to say a word or two about Yemen? You served there, and since we're talking about Saudi Arabia,
I'm now, it's been a long time since I followed Yemen closely. I think the war was probably unnecessary at the beginning. The Iranian position in Yemen was pretty small. Yemen has never been important to Iran. Once the war got going, then the Houthis, Ansarullah, needed support, which gave Iran a lot of room in which to expand their place. For Iran, this is almost the perfect position. They can make life extremely difficult for the Saudis. They can cost them billions. And if the Saudis win the war, Iran loses virtually nothing because they never had much of a position in Yemen to begin with. I mean, that's kind of hog heaven, if you'll take that un-Islamic parable, for Iran. You can't get any better than that. I don't know that the Saudis absolutely needed to go to war, but they're paranoid about Yemen. They were paranoid about Yemen when I was there. Now they've got themselves locked into a fight, which they probably cannot win. They can't lose it, but they're not winning. They remind me years ago when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, my father quipped that every country was entitled to the Vietnam of its choice. And to some extent, the Saudis have managed to find that. Now they need a political solution. The question is, can they get one? In the early days of the war, the Security Council passed a resolution which basically is not doable, which was essentially would be a Saudi victory that the Houthis lay down their arms and go back to their box. That's not doable. The question is now, can you reach some level of political stability, and in the process of negotiating it, can you prevent massive humanitarian catastrophe? And I don't know what is possible any longer. And now you have so many different intertwining factions, because you not only got a war with the Saudis and the Emiratis fighting the Houthis, you've got them supporting a Yemeni government which has almost no power. You've got a secessionist movement going in the south. Hasn't quite broken out, but it's pretty clear. You've got splits between the Emiratis and the Saudis on what they want as a political goal. And you still got al-Qaeda reinforcing its position in some parts of Yemen. Trying to bring all of those elements into one place, I can only say that I'm very glad I'm not the UN negotiator. But it is also clear that you probably cannot get a military victory. So now the question becomes the limits of the possible. And the chances are that you will have to take piece by piece some humanitarian progress, pressure for negotiations. I'm perfectly happy with the Congress cutting off the military supply, which doesn't stop the Saudi war, but it's a sort of a shot across the bow that we're really serious about. You guys got to figure out a way to get out of it. Ultimately, the Saudis, with the Emiratis, have to figure out what is something they can tolerate, which is a lot less than what they wanted, and we have to see whether the Houthis are prepared to accept a political solution.
They may feel that, well, they can't win a victory.
I don't think they can win, but I don't, it's going to be a lot of bargaining, and it's going to go on for a long time, and it's one hell of a mess. And I wish I could give you a clearer picture for where this goes. It's pretty easy to get to the point of saying it's got to be negotiated. It can't be what the Saudi war aims have been from the beginning. But then when you get past that and try to say, okay, what can they be? What's a solution that does protect Saudi Arabia? How do you keep Iran out? How do you reach a balance to these forces? What do they do with the South? The one thing you can say is that those things are all going to have to be agreed by the combatants. They're not going to be the bright idea brought in from the outside.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of that things can always get worse.
Yeah.
Maybe one or two final questions. Yes.
3 days ago, there was a standoff between the Northern Alliance and the Afghan government in Mazar-Sharif. Is that the product of like America's 18 years involvement in Afghanistan?
No, that's the product of some internal squabbling between Afghan forces, which they seem to have gotten on top of. But given that squabbling, that obviously is one of the reasons President Ghani is not so keen on having representatives of that piece of Jamiat brought into the negotiations he wants to control. I think that is a result of political tensions and also of tensions, inter-Afghan tensions, but I don't think it is a huge deal.
All right, a final question? Sir, in the middle.
I was wondering about, I'm interested in Pakistan and the Karakoram Highway, the Chinese effort in that area there. Do you think that they might fill a vacuum if we were to pull out of Afghanistan? I think they have mineral interest in that area, don't they?
The Chinese are worried about Afghanistan. They've become much more vocal in the last few years about the subject. I would not say they've really put their money where their mouth is. That's unfair, I think. They have a very strong relationship with Pakistan. I think they have exerted diplomatic efforts to try to get Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. I do not think the Chinese will go beyond that in using that leverage. Pakistan is, I think, a different kind of diplomatic problem. Pakistan is too important for them to break a lot of crockery there. They worry about Afghanistan partly because you have Chinese insurgents from the Uyghurs who are established there, partly because the Chinese are great proponents of stability, and they can see that if Afghanistan breaks apart, since you not only have the Taliban and the Islamic State there, you've got the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and you've got some Tajik rebels. You've got about 20 different terrorist groups that are functioning in Afghanistan, a number of which have aims in countries around there. So the Chinese really don't like the idea of this place breaking down. They'd like peace. They'll talk to the Pakistanis about it. But their interests in Pakistan are much larger than their interests in Afghanistan. They've never actually, they have a big copper contract there, a $3 billion contract, but they've never developed it. So that their interests, their physical interests there are much smaller than their physical interests in Pakistan. So you will get a certain amount of help from them. They've gone quite a ways from where they were at 4 or 5 years ago when I was at a conference in Beijing, and the professor who headed it, who's now a senior political advisor in the government, said, well, China, I asked him about Chinese policy, and he said, I think you can expect cautious passivity. Well, they've got a little better than that. You know, they are using some influence, and they're pushing on it, but I think that's about the limit of what you could expect from them.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. That was a very sophisticated tour de raison of a lot of these problems, and we appreciate it very much. Let's give a great hand to our
Thank you.
Ambassador Ron Neumann.
Thank you very much. It's a lot of fun doing it.